This is Shauna Miller, and welcome to the Who For podcast. So I guess the two questions that I have going into this interview with Dr. Nazita Lajevardi, a political scientist and attorney from Michigan State University. The two questions that I have are, do we still have racism? And if we do have racism, why? I think the best way to get at these two questions is to look at the inputs. So what are we consuming? What are we giving to the people of our country to make them think, feel, and behave a certain way? And then how far does that go? How do the inputs manifest? What are the consequences of having certain people consume certain material? Because some of you might disagree with me, but racism is kind of a deep-rooted identity thing. It's a ranking. It's a us versus them. There's a competition. Where does that come from? People have been different for forever. People have lived as neighbors and respected each other on site. So in this opportunity to ask questions, I'd like to ask, how far does this go? And are we willing to face it? Because if I was the average white nationalist, it would be difficult for me to face that my willingness to restrict others and reinforce society structure based on race is dependent upon a news story or inputs from our media companies and from our government. So I'll ask again, how do you get a person to believe that? What things do you show them? What differences do you point out to make humans, instead of seeing a difference and being like, oh, interesting, to there being a ranking? And then going as so far as exterminating the rest of the people. And then believing that what you're doing is so good that everybody else should die. For this episode, racism is defined as people's willingness to support policy that restricts other people according to race. Dr. Lajevardi empirically records changes in attitudes towards certain groups after a treatment, which is a transcript of a CNN, Fox News, or MSNBC news story. And after we learn that the news media forms opinions so strongly that people kill each other over those opinions, do we even have the power to do anything about that?
So I deep dive read your paper, and I would just like to tell you the diligence by which you discussed the assumptions. I really liked it. Like, you went through and you said, so here are the existing arguments, and here's exactly the logical reasons why this doesn't serve us well, or that this work is incomplete and that it's very essential. So anyways, I just wanted to say, like, I really appreciated how you fleshed out all of those little things, because I think I don't want to group us together, but for people like us, like, we have to be very tight with what we say and what we assert. And I think that you did a really great job of making it as standard as, not standard, legitimate as possible, I guess.
Was it hard for you to interpret the arguments? Was it translatable? Was it hard to understand, or?
So, no. I would say, from the outside reader, it would be difficult, maybe if they're not used to reading data in a paragraph form, Yeah. But my most recent job was at the LBB, and we were just in stuff like this all the time. So my brain no, it wasn't hard to follow. And I really liked how, you put in the different experiments, I loved the contrast. Anyways, okay. I really liked it. I thought it was fantastic. And I loved how you talked about, I think this is really important, the foreign versus the domestic Muslim and the messaging there. I totally get it. They're not talking trash about American Muslims, really hardly at all. They're only talking about foreign Muslims, but that is directly impacting domestic ones.
Glad that was clear.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, totally. So first, can you tell us about who you are and kind of what has led you to be so passionate about what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so I am an assistant professor of political science at Michigan State University. Prior to getting my PhD, I went to law school, and I'm a member of the California Bar. while I was in law school, I began doing some research on the Patriot Act, trying to understand ways in which widespread surveillance had become the law of the land as these programs were disproportionately targeting Muslim Americans. I really enjoyed doing research and decided from there, with the support of a lot of mentors, to pursue a PhD. So I've been thinking about how Muslim Americans have become situated so low in the American sociopolitical context for a long time.
So you mentioned that the Patriot Act disproportionately affects Muslim Americans. How do you know that? What are the things that you were seeing? What is the data that you saw that was like, okay, I need to look into this?
Well, widespread surveillance was certainly being conducted by the NSA at the time, and it was disproportionately targeting American Muslims where there was some sort of suspicion that they may be involved in terrorist activities. I did some research on Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which essentially allowed for warrantless searches, essentially allowed for there to be warrantless investigations into individuals' records. So they could be telephone records, for instance, texting records. But there was essentially an infinite gag order on these companies that were requested to turn over information about people. So people weren't even aware that they were being surveyed. And so there were a lot of questions about the constitutionality of these practices. And so while we can't FOIA request successfully to figure out who was being targeted, I think there's enough anecdotal evidence and discussion among the community to know that this was something that was very much understood to be happening in the American Muslim community. The New York PD has been revealed to conduct infiltration practices into the American Muslim community as well. So, you had surveillance of different forms. The Patriot Act certainly lent itself to some form of federal type of surveillance, but surveillance also was occurring at the local level as well.
So you're seeing all of these things happen, and you're seeing this community, you're seeing police acting in ways that they haven't acted in before, right? So there's been a change. So what led you to asking the two questions that you ask in your paper, which is, is there a difference in attitude post 9/11, and what are the impacts of that? So what led you to that?
So the media has long been recognized as an important lens into understanding the issues that are salient to the public.
So you mean like the news is a direct reflection of how the public receives information and kind of our reality that we construct?
Sort of, yeah. So the media communicates to the mass public. You have to understand, especially prior to social media, people turned to the news media to get a sense of what was happening in the world. It was a very important conduit for shaping public attitudes, for conveying messages to them. And because it was communicating information to the public, the news media does two things. It communicates information, but by giving disproportionate weight and, speaking about issues in a certain way, it can actually also shape public attitudes. So it can disseminate information, and we can look at the dissemination to understand perhaps how often groups are being communicated, in which ways they're being communicated. But we can also think about the media as an important influencer of public attitude because it gives disproportionate weight to certain tropes and messages and stereotypes.
And I think this was pretty evident in your paper. Something that I wrote down over and over again was inputs versus outputs. And you really focus on what specifically are people ingesting as news and what is the direct result from that. And I think that's really important. So I wanted to ask you about your methods. Can you just talk to me about, when you approach the problem, what were you setting up? And this is the first time I've kind of asked for a really big drill down, because I think that this is going to be very important for us to say, we're not just saying that America is biased towards Muslim Americans. We're showing you and demonstrating it. And people do these things in studies all the time. They show conclusions and they demonstrate what they know. But it's like the public doesn't ever have access to this. And so the only thing that they really hear is the thesis of the media has influenced America's bias. This is why I'm framing the question this way, is because I want to know the moving parts that you felt that you needed to address and how you encapsulated your methods is really what I'm asking. Is that clear? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's clear. I can't really respond to those conclusions because I'm not trying to say that. We'll get into the methods.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges in studying American Muslims and trying to understand how the public might have felt or thought about them over time is that we haven't actually been asking about them in surveys. So for instance, if you go back to publicly available databases where surveys are available for download. So one example of this is called the Roper Center. They host surveys that have historically been asked. And if they're publicly available, you can download the surveys if you have a subscription. At the time that I was doing my research, only 3 surveys that asked about either Islam, Muslims broadly, or Muslim Americans were available prior to 2001.
You're saying like in this whole database of surveys, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of surveys, only 3 of them? Okay.
That I was able to find while I was writing all this. And so if you want to take a historical look at how Muslims have been treated, you actually can't go back to surveys and evaluate how the public has viewed them over time, because you don't have a consistent set of questionnaires that have been asking this question, especially that predate 9/11, which was, of course, an important event in this country. And so one way to get at that is to look at the news media, because, of course, the news media has been communicating different issues that are salient to the mass public over time. And so that is why I began this work. I started to first turn to the news media as a lens. I looked at it for precisely its role, which is to communicate information. And so I was trying to understand how often Muslims were being communicated to the public. To do that, however, you need to download and essentially look at all of the media, all of the broadcasts that has been disseminated, all of the news media. And
you have to have something to compare it to. You have to have, if you come out with a number and say, well, Muslims have been negatively portrayed this many times, that doesn't mean anything, because you're not looking at, well, how much percentage of the stories are being written about that? What percentage of people of other minority groups are being talked about in comparison to Muslim Americans? So I see what you mean by you have to get all of it, or else you can't really show.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to get all of it precisely. So what I do in my paper is it's split into 2 parts. The first part kind of tries to evaluate how often Muslims and Muslim Americans, and I make this distinction between the 2 that I can get into in a bit, how often Muslims foreign or globally versus Muslim Americans, a domestic group that's specifically being referred to as a domestic group, are being portrayed in the news media compared to other socially stigmatized groups that we know are overrepresented and then also negatively portrayed, like Latinos and African Americans, as well as Asian Americans. And so that's the first part of the paper. The second part of the paper then turns to the fact that, as I mentioned before, the news media can play a role in shaping attitudes because it gives disproportionate weight to certain tropes and certain stories. And it evaluates how portrayals or segments on Muslims versus Muslim Americans shape attitudes towards the group at home. So it's really a 2-part paper.
Okay, so you have a quote here, yet the news media is neither neutral nor value-free. Scholars have examined how media sources frame and prime minority racial groups to the general public and have found that the news media tends to portray them as troublesome constituents. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so the news media, there's a negativity bias in the news media that has long been found in the scholarship. Soroka's work points to this, but it definitely predates that with Entman has done this work. Gilliam and Yangar have certainly done this work as well. So the news media provides disproportionate weight to minorities, the scholarship has long found. And when it does cover these groups, it tends to associate them with negative stereotypes and frames. And because it is giving, the news media is describing these groups negatively in association with stereotypes that portray them as troublesome people, that actually has effects on public opinion. And so this has been established, particularly with African American and Latino individuals, especially in local news.
And the problem, I've heard that bad news sells more. So like what I'm saying is what scholarship has shown is that news media companies use bad news specifically with disproportionately minorities on their news channels. You don't have to agree with me or not, but that leads me to think that they have reason to believe that they make more money doing these stories. Which is driving which, the chicken or the egg? Are the stories driving the money, or is the money driving the stories? I don't know. I just think that it's interesting that, all of these news media companies are obviously for profit. So there's always some kind of incentive and motivation behind it. And so I think that's very interesting to really look at it in this way, because it's showing us that sometimes up to like 36% of the stories that we're seeing are negative stories about foreign Muslims sometimes. And like that means a large part of their strategy, their overall business model is revolving around negative stories around Muslim people. And that's...
I wouldn't go so far as to paint it that way. I think I wouldn't go that far. Those are really big leaps to make. I think that what we can say...
It's about the incentives. So like if profit is an incentive for them and they're doing these stories, I'm not making any conclusions here. I'm just saying that's interesting to think about where the money is involved with the messaging.
I think that you're right, that ratings matter for the news media, and they especially have an incentive to keep their viewers engaged. And studies have shown that people privilege negative information, and especially so when negative information is tied to terror. People remember those broadcasts, those snippets, that information a lot more.
That makes sense. It's terror. It's frightening. It's things that strike fear rather than comfort. So it's disjarring. Like I see how that
it gets into your like fight or flight responses. It gets different parts of your limbic system going. I think just negative information and fear, right? Just evolutionarily, they affect our brain and our attention.
So, okay. So then the next thing that you go into is not only is the news portraying this, but we're getting this result. And you say that a big problem with this is about personal experience with the average person. And I think that's really important, because if you only are getting your news coverage from the media and you don't have any personal experience with a normal, everyday Muslim American who is doing all of the same things that everybody else is doing in this stream of capitalism, it's hard to humanize them, I guess.
So Muniba Salim's work has found that like having direct contact with Muslims matters, but when you don't have direct contact, the over-reliance on the media for information about Muslims is linked to having negative emotions towards them or holding stereotypic beliefs towards them. So contact certainly does matter, and you can understand how without it, the news media can fill some gaps.
I mean, if nobody has ever met anyone or heard of anybody that has met anybody that is a different religion than them, I mean, the only exposure you get is what other people tell you in the news. So, okay, so we talk about the impacts that this makes, and you discuss that in the second half of the paper a lot, but what was happening after September 11th that had changed? Because you mentioned outbreak of hostility and hate crimes. So what exactly are we talking about?
So 9/11 was a turning point for American Muslims, but that's not to say that Muslims had not had a negative or distrustful relationship with especially law enforcement beforehand. Certainly, there's been historical distrust, particularly with the Nation of Islam and law enforcement. The reality is that after 9/11, a number of events occurred. We had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had Guantanamo Bay prison. We had the Abu Ghraib scandal. We had the Boston Marathon bombing. We had a slew of bombings here in the United States. We had the Syrian civil war. We had what I'm going to put in quotation marks, the refugee crisis. So there were a number of events where Islam and Muslims interchangeably, without care, were frequently entering our news cycle because there were a number of events that were occurring related to war, terrorism, and geopolitical conflicts that they were producing like images that painted Muslims as violent, as negative, as barbaric, as inferior, as disloyal, as threatening.
So I just want to talk about what that specifically means. So they would go show footage of military people instead of the everyday person, or they would show maybe weapons or things involved in the stories, or they would say certain things. So what are the kind of stories are we talking about?
So I guess I don't feel comfortable using the term everyday people or normal people. I think that's really reductive.
I think I meant like not actually violent or terrorists. I think that's what I meant.
Yeah, I don't. So there's like some ways to get at this. You can get to this through topic modeling and try to see what are the top words that come up. So because I don't have the videos, I can't actually speak to that empirically. But for instance, like in CNN, for the Muslim data set that I have, pretty frequently topics related to ISIS and attacks was coming up, Iraq war, Baghdad troops was coming up, investigations, bombing, FBI, and terror were coming up. The Serbian-Bosnian conflict was coming up quite a bit. Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Taliban, military, war, these types of topics were coming up. And so, as you can see, a lot of these key words that were popping up over and over again as topics are related to conflicts that were occurring outside of the United States and have to do with literally terrorism and war.
So what is your response to an argument that says, well, they were just reporting the news? This was happening, and so they have to say it because that's what's happening.
I think other things were also happening. Where was the coverage of the other stuff?
Totally. Yeah, totally. So I would love for you to talk about, like we said before, the foreign versus domestic Muslim and your methods going into making those groups.
Yeah. So I think it's important to treat the term Muslim and the term Muslim Americans as distinct for one another for the purposes of the analyses that I do. I do it for theoretical purposes. So first, Muslims broadly, generally, I argue, refers to a population that is largely foreign and outside of the United States when one sort of thinks of how the mass public might be conceptualizing of the term. So because there is this widespread tendency for people to conflate the religion of Islam and its adherents that are abroad with what's going on here at home, I think that it's really important to understand if in fact this is true. So is it actually the case that coverage of a foreign group matters for the experiences of a domestic group? So that is part of the reasoning for why I treat them as distinct categories. There's also some scholarship showing that the American public actually doesn't differentiate very much between the two groups. And this is because there's such a politicization of events that are tied to the foreign group. So the American group is very much arguably affected by what's going on in terms of what's happening with the foreign group. But they are distinct. They are incredibly distinct. The two populations don't mirror each other. The American Muslim population doesn't mirror the foreign population, the foreign Muslim population.
Because a lot more diversity in U.S. Muslims?
Exactly. So the American Muslim population has a large degree of racial diversity, actually, that is not mirrored in the foreign population. So actually, the two groups are quite distinct. It's also important to say that the American Muslim population does not resemble the Muslim population in Europe either, right? So each of these countries has a very unique history with their Muslim immigrant populations and native-born populations as well. So I think it's important to be very theoretically careful here.
Yeah, so it's only one sentence, but I really sunk into this. So American-born Black Muslims perceive discrimination on the basis of religion and race at high and nearly equal levels, saying 96% there is a lot of discrimination against Muslims in America, and 94% there's also a lot of discrimination against Black people. So it sounds like U.S. domestic Black Muslims that identify themselves as Black. It's both. It's both race and religion at that point. When that's tied to things like acculturation, and you said even wearing a hijab, like, that's very interesting that the tolerance of people gets even so. Okay. The only reason I wanted to bring this sentence up is really to say I'm upset about it. I don't really have anything to say, but it's just like, I'm upset about it. Anyways.
Just to maybe spend a minute on that, like,
great.
Intersectionality matters. We have a portfolio of identities, and we can experience discrimination that targets different part of our identities. And so, especially when you live in a body where your identity that belongs to different marginalized groups is so visible for each of those groups, you may actually, of course, be more likely to perceive discrimination than others who maybe are not as visible. And so, trying to understand intersectionality, trying to understand that, especially for like Black Muslims, you can be visible and aware of discrimination and targeted for discrimination on a myriad of dimensions, I think is rather important, and I think this is why it's really interesting to study a group very deeply, which I'm not doing here, but in general, I think it's very important because there's a lot of nuance.
Exactly. No, and that's, a big part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is because we're trying to flesh out the nuances that are so simplified. And when you simplify messaging, it's so much easier to make something controversial or make something controversial forever. If it's two words, two different sides can fight about it to infinity. And I think that's what they do a lot. And when I say they, I mean the evil people that run our planet. So anyways, hostility towards Muslims, first foreign and second to negative media coverage. I circled that and I wanted to ask you, so U.S. Muslims perceive a great deal of discrimination. They attribute this hostility first to Muslims foreign and second to negative media coverage.
Yeah. So what I did here was that I was building a theory for why we should look at coverage of foreign or global coverage of Muslims versus coverage about the domestic group. One of the reasons I argue that we should do that is because actually surveys have shown that American Muslims, when asked why, they perceive a lot of discrimination, they're actually saying, we think it's because of negative media coverage and the fact that there's stuff going on with Muslims abroad. They actually point to that as the most common reasons for perceiving a lot of discrimination. So it sort of begs the question, well, is this happening?
Yeah, so this is part of like what was leading you to this experiment. Okay, so I would like to talk about, let's go into the experiment a little bit more, because I think that the way that you choose your terms and your values is very interesting. So the first question that you talk about is the volume of coverage. So can we talk about just kind of what you found with the volume of coverage?
Yeah, so that's not yet the experiment. That's still the media analysis, but...
Sorry, the media analysis.
Yeah, so I start with CNN to first look at the proportion of coverage. And what I find is that actually from 1992 to 2000, African American, Muslims globally, Muslim Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos, none of these groups were even mentioned in 10% of broadcasts on the CNN platform. But after 2001, there was a gradual increase in proportion that each group was receiving each year. So, for example, in 2004, the CNN coverage mentioned Muslims in 17.54% of its broadcasts, African Americans in 8.8% of its broadcasts, and Latinos in 6.3% of its broadcasts. And if you recall, at that time, President Bush was running for re-election, and the country was in the middle of 2 wars in the Middle East. And then by 2006, this number changed again, with Muslims being mentioned in 28% of broadcasts, Blacks in 10.7%, and Latinos in 9.5%. That year, the country was recovering from Hurricane Katrina. There were protests about the DREAM Act. Saddam Hussein was executed, and the Iraq War was quite deadly at that point. But as you can see in the plot, for those of you who have it with you, the tables turned in 2008 with President Obama's election. So African Americans appeared in 33% of broadcasts, Latinos in 20.89%, and Muslim coverage dips at this point to only 11.98%. By the 2016 campaign, which I think is very important to know, each of the three groups was being communicated at very high rates to the American public. Muslims appeared in 28.4% of CNN coverage, and Blacks in 28.7%, and Latinos in 24.5%. So by 2016, during this presidential election year, where we all, I think, have come to associate it with a high degree of discussion about race, the American public was being exposed to a great deal of information about stigmatized groups, including Muslims, through news coverage, much more so than from 2 decades prior. And I show that these trends are affirmed on MSNBC and Fox in the post-2001 period as well. So what I find is also a very large degree of coverage about these groups on Fox and MSNBC by 2016 as well.
So this is definitely not something that you did in your study, because I think this would probably be impossible, but I would love to, if I could be a fly on the wall somewhere, I would love to know when the conversations were happening about public opinion about the different wars that we were entering into, and kind of the strategies behind the messaging to the media about, my dad was in the military, and then he got out in the 90s, and then he re-enlisted right after 2001. And he was actually, he was in, this is kind of he was in the initial invasion of Baghdad. He was an Apache pilot, and he was there. And what they told them at the time was grounded in truth, of course, but there was a lot of inflation about what foreign Muslims were personally doing to us as Americans. Mm-hmm. And I guess just the question that I would like to ask is, at what point were there, like, the Dixie Chicks? And I think it was like 2004, the Dixie Chicks were like, George Bush is ruining everything. The wars are immoral. This is ridiculous, all of these things. And then it seems like kind of during that time, the messaging increases from the news stations. And we can't say this because we can't empirically demonstrate it, but I think that's an interesting question of, when did they need the public to really hate foreign Muslim people? And from a strategic point, I see why they would do that, right? But they're not addressing what you're saying is the incredible negative effects for domestic Muslims. Like, there's a direct effect, a negative effect on them. So
I forgot about the Dixie Chicks.
Right? They disappeared because of, they literally canceled because they said, this is messed up.
Yeah. Now that you brought it up, I remember it. But yeah, it's not something that I've tested or I've even come across, but
I just know how these people work because I've seen them in the small rooms and how they literally are like, let's put these words in here instead so it'll make people think this thing. And this is what I'm trying to get people to get what happens here. Okay, so can we talk about the next thing, which is kind of well, in my opinion, the positive versus negative coverage, because I think that's really important.
Sure, yeah. So I conduct sentiment analysis on the broadcast. So what that means is...
tell me about that, because context clues put it together, but what does it mean?
Yeah, so sentiment analysis is a process where you have a dictionary of words, and it's basically a pre-assigned dictionary that I use. And each word gets a certain value in terms of positivity and negativity. So a word like terror might get, -5, but a word like win might get +2. And then neutral words like prepositions will get 0. And essentially what sentiment analysis does is it gives a value to each of the words in a given broadcast transcript, and then it takes the sum of it. So each broadcast gets a certain score, and then I look at the average scores that each of these stigmatized groups that I'm interested in are receiving over time. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, and I was thinking about how, the question is how do you analyze a nation's attitude towards a certain thing? And so I really like how logically you broke that down. You made a dictionary and you assigned value.
I didn't make the dictionary. The dictionary pre-existed, but yeah, I used it.
Okay. So you use an official. No, that makes sense. Okay, so
what I do is I show that the coverage that all of these groups receive just on all 3 platforms tends to be more negative than the coverage of the average broadcast that is airing on that network. So at first glance, these analyses are confirming what other studies have shown us, which is that these groups get pretty negative coverage. But the coverage of Muslims and Muslim Americans tends to be below that of other stigmatized groups. So that was sort of an important finding to show that all of these groups get negative coverage, but
disproportionately. Okay. So, and then you say the analysis cannot isolate whether, because I think this is important to say, is whether the media is directly treating Muslims negatively or whether the media is discussing other topics or events negatively and those topics just happen to be associated with Muslims. We can't say the why as to why Muslims are disproportionately negative, have negative stories, but we can say that it is happening.
Yeah, I can't draw that conclusion, unfortunately. I wish I could figure out which it was, but yeah. So just to recap, the media analyses have a few takeaways, so I think it's important to state them.
Great.
First, the news media did communicate Muslim Americans, a domestic group, more negatively than other stigmatized domestic groups like Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans in the post 9/11 period. But these 3 other groups that are domestic stigmatized groups also receive negative coverage as well. So it's not a war of oppression Olympics, but Muslim Americans are also receiving negative coverage. Second, the coverage of the foreign group Muslims grew in proportion to equal and at times surpass that of African Americans and Latinos in the post 9/11 period on 3 different cable news networks, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC.
Oh, and you know what? I meant to bring this up earlier. It was very interesting for me to see that you measured the non-major. So you didn't do CBS or ABC. You did the news stations that's all they do all day, every day is news. And that's where they make their money. So I thought that was interesting that you chose them because I guess it's a little bit more pure because it's all news all the time because there's arguments being made right now that ABC, not only do they do news, but all of their shows are all included in their messaging as well. So you obviously don't take on that battle, but I thought it was interesting that you chose those 3 because I probably would have chose those 3 too. Sorry. So anyways, continue.
And ideologically, they all differ,
Exactly.
Fox is to the right, MSNBC is to the left, CNN is somewhere in the middle, so there is like an ideological spectrum, which gets me to the final point, which is that the ideology of the news outlet does matter for how negatively they discuss the group.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Did we talk about how Fox News is more negative? Do we want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, just like you would probably expect. They talk about all of the groups pretty negatively, more so than CNN and MSNBC. So next, I might move on to the second question, which is, Are news media portrayals, do they have an impact? Do they frame and prime to the general public? Do they shape attitudes towards Muslims, foreign and domestic? And so I am here very interested in understanding whether portrayals of the foreign group are consequential for the experiences of a domestic group. And so what I do is I run 4 survey experiments. These are online surveys that are disseminated to US adult survey takers, and they are randomized into reading text of news broadcasts where I only vary a couple things, but the rest of the broadcast is identical. So what I did was I actually developed broadcasts that were very similar to actual broadcasts that had been airing in my data set. And essentially, what I do in the first 3 experiments is I ask a set of questions directly before and directly after people read these treatments, they're called. And what they're being asked directly before and directly after are a set of questions that are meant to measure people's attitudes towards American Muslims. And essentially, I developed 9 statements that capture stereotypes towards American Muslims. And I take the average before and the average after as well. So I'm really trying to understand if at the individual level, people are changing their opinions about Muslims or not after viewing a broadcast. And what I'm varying in each experiment is whether the person is being exposed to an article about Muslims foreign or Muslims domestic, and whether the coverage is positive or negative. So I'm really trying to understand if there is the spillover effect of being exposed to negative news information about Muslims or Muslim Americans translates into shifting attitudes towards Muslim Americans as well as policy positions.
Okay, so these 9 stereotypical statements, I guess. So, for example, most Muslim Americans integrate successfully into American culture. Sometimes Muslim Americans do not have the best interests of Americans at heart. Most Muslim Americans lack basic English language skills. Most Muslim Americans are not terrorists. Wearing headscarves should be banned in all public places. So you give kind of positive, well, I mean, I guess subjectively positive and negative statements to where you can test based on the input of the news story if the output of any of these statements would change. Do you ask them about these statements before reading the news?
In experiments 1 to 3, I do, but statements 1, 5, 7, and 9 are reverse coded so that higher values indicate like greater hostility.
Okay, yeah.
That's like a pretty typical thing in surveys, is like not just having all of the statements be positive or negative, just to make sure people are engaging with.
Gotcha. No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You can have some comparison. Okay, so then the next thing is, can we talk about imagery and sound effects? We won't be able to talk about it a lot, but this is something that I'm very interested in with the massive manipulation of human brains. So what did you discover?
So I do not have anything in here to say about imagery or sound effects. I think it's really important to note that people are just viewing a text that reads like a broadcast. So it has the name of a person and it says if they're the host, and then it has the name of somebody else who says they're like an analyst. And so people are reading and have to use their imagination. But you can imagine in the real world, when they're actually watching a segment, there's all these additional factors that matter, which is like, what is in the banner below the anchor? What are the images being showcased? What does the anchor themselves look like? What is
the title of the banner is super important. I think I've seen the analysis of different networks covering the same topics and the banners being like ridiculously different. Okay, yeah, no, I think that's important too, because you're doing the experiment, they're reading off of things, you're not getting the full, so that needs to be considered.
Yeah, and arguably, like when you watch a video and you're just watching the news, there's a lot of processes that are being tapped into, and so this is just capturing one of the things, which is just the content.
Totally, yeah, okay, and so I like how you again, it's all about comparison. So I like how you go into, are domestic Muslims being negatively impacted by just any group? And you go through and you say, no, it's not. Negative coverage about Latinos or Blacks is not contributing to domestic Muslim American. The impact we're seeing is negative coverage about foreign Muslims impacting domestic Muslims.
Yeah, I think it's very important to test whether coverage that's negative in general would shape people's attitudes or whether it has to be specific to a group. And the results in experiments 3 and 4 show that for the most part, it's really the coverage of Muslims and Muslim Americans that matters, and not so much for other groups.
Okay, and then this is my favorite part. We finally got to my favorite part. So the policy. I love how you set this up. So do you want to walk us through this part?
Yeah, so after they view the fictional transcript, they're asked about their support for a series of policies. And each of the policies kind of manipulates the Trump statement that was made in December 2015, where he proposed to ban Muslims. And originally, he had proposed to ban American Muslims. If they left the US, he was going to ban them from re-entering. And then he modified the statement later on. And so there's 3 versions of this statement. The first is support for limiting all immigration. And the statement is, limiting all immigration from all countries of origin until the nation's representatives can figure out what's going on. The second is limiting immigration from Muslim countries of origin until the nation's representatives can figure out what's going on. And the third is limiting Muslim Americans from re-entering the US if they've left for any reason, i.e. vacation, work, longer visits, until the nation's representatives can figure out what's going on.
So each level is more specific and restrictive coming towards domestic Muslims. Okay.
Exactly. And I think what's really interesting is that those who were exposed to negative treatments were significantly more likely than those exposed to positive treatments to support each of these policies for the most part across the board. But what's perhaps the most disconcerting is that support for the third position, which is limiting Muslim Americans from re-entering, is the most dire. That's really where we see the largest differences emerge across each of the studies. And so really negative coverage of Muslims seems to have a very concrete effect for support for a policy that would affect Muslim Americans from even re-entering their own home.
So it looks like respondents in negative Muslim American treatments were significantly more likely than their counterparts to support the 3 policies by 0.081, 0.089. So those are pretty close together, but it looks like both of them increased their likelihood to support those policies with the negative treatment. But then it goes up to 0.131 when they're asking if domestic Muslims should be able to re-enter the country. That's almost double.
Yeah, it's okay, not almost.
It's not double, but
it's definitely more. And that's only in experiment 2. In experiment 3, there's a lot of support, but it's not the highest levels. And in experiment 4, also there's a great deal of support.
And what I wrote down here is, so basically what we're suggesting is media is affecting attitudes towards domestic Muslims, and it's increasing people's willingness to restrict them across the board. Like that's what your data is showing. That's very unfortunate. You know how many times I've said that in my record? I guess this is my 5th recording now, and I've said that's very unfortunate a lot of times. I need to make that on.
I'm going to give you some positive information. So you can
There's not a lot of positive information I'm talking about here on this podcast. Maybe, you know what? I'm going to do a throw in like happy episode every once in a while. Because, I mean, I don't know if you talk about happy stuff in your classes, but most of my courses were very depressing in college because we were talking about reality. And it was just so different from anything that I'd ever learned before. And there was a lot of like, you know what I mean, in the classes. Okay, so did we cover everything that we needed to cover for the experiments?
I think so.
All right, so implications. Can you tell me kind of just broadly what this means for what we have right now and our kind of attitudes towards policy, and then what this means kind of for the future? I just want to know your thoughts. So this might be departing from the paper a little bit, but I would just like to hear your thoughts about, or maybe your commentary of what you're seeing now and where we're moving towards. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but I definitely have noticed a shift in the media very recently. I mean, I saw Visa encouraging us to vote last fall. That was shocking to me. So, where are we and where are we going is my question.
It's a good question. I think context matters for how groups experience their day-to-day lives. So if you look at the rise in Asian American hate crimes and the politicization of COVID is being related to China, like you can see very similarly patterns, at least anecdotally, about the politicization of a foreign group and country, the experiences of a domestic group, right? So when President Trump was calling COVID the quote Kung flu, end quote, and blaming China for a number of things, but including conflict over COVID, there was a correlation, right? That Asian American life became harder for them and they were facing increases in violence. And
yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anything personally that like that. I've obviously seen discrimination and negative treatment towards Muslims in my personal life, but I have not seen, since coronavirus and all of these things, I haven't seen this, but I definitely have seen on social media influencers calling for the end of violence towards Asian people. And the reason I'm bringing this up is it was like this, it arrived. It's like there was a difference from before COVID and after COVID. It seems like there's kind of a clear shift. And I think that's what's really important for your work, because there's a clear shift when a crisis moment happens, how the media is encouraging the public to react to that crisis.
So I think the media, when it gives disproportionate weight to issues, it can create a backlash against people if they're linked to those issues and the issues are being framed negatively. So what I was trying to say is that in recent times, I think context matters because you can see pretty clearly that Asian Americans have been publicly attacked in what appear to be hate crimes. And this has been documented this year. And there's some evidence that basically finds that since the start of the pandemic, almost 3 in 10 Asian Americans say that they have been mistreated or discriminated against based on their race. So the reality is that, as it matters when Muslims are in the news cycle. It matters when they're in the public discourse, right? At the moment, the conflicts that we have abroad with Muslim people are not entering the news cycle as much. Something else has replaced it for now. But for a long time, that was the key thing that we were talking about. And so I think it remains to be seen if it fades from the national discourse or not. It remains to be seen where we move from here. But certainly the same patterns that I document in my work could apply to other groups. And I think we are seeing some of that, at least anecdotally, with anti-Asian American violence, at least an attitude. So that's something to keep your eye on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for asking me to be a part of this and for engaging with the work and reading it. It's really nice. I appreciate it.